In July 1944, representatives of 44 nations spent 3 weeks inside a hotel in the New Hampshire mountains, designing the financial rules the rest of the world would live under for the next generation. 27 years later, one government ended those rules with a single Sunday night television address and did not ask the other 43 first. This is the story of how a fixed rate on gold, a hotel full of exhausted economists, and a rivalry between two men who never fully agreed on anything produced the system that ran the global economy for nearly 3 decades. And how a president, a small group, to an end in a single afternoon. Why did the world need a new financial system at all in 1944? The answer sits in the decade before it. The architects who eventually gathered in New Hampshire had lived through the 1930s, and they blamed a great deal of that decade's suffering on a currency system that had in practice come apart at the seams. The interwar gold standard is described by economic historians as structurally flawed and poorly managed, one of the proximate causes of the worldwide depression that followed. Nations responded to hard times by devaluing their own currencies to make exports cheaper, a strategy sometimes called a beggar thy neighbor policy, and by walling off their economies behind tariffs and import restrictions. Every country trying to save itself made the shared problem worse. Economic historians have since described the protectionist policies of that era as anarchic and autarkic, policies that, in one assessment, worked inconsistently and self-defeatingly to promote national import substitution. The post-war planners took 2 lessons from this directly into their guiding principles for whatever came next. No more beggar thy neighbor currency devaluations, and some mechanism to control the flows of speculative financial capital that had helped destabilize the system in the first place. So representatives of 44 allied nations, 730 delegates in total, checked into the Mount Washington Hotel in the small town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire on the 1st of July 1944. The conference ran 3 weeks, closing on the 22nd of July. The American delegation was led on paper by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr., who served as the conference's president. But the chief American negotiator, the man actually shaping the American position at the table, was a Treasury official named Harry Dexter White. Great Britain's chief negotiator was the economist John Maynard Keynes, already one of the most influential economic thinkers alive. White and Keynes did not want the same system. Keynes proposed something the world had never used before, an international reserve currency called the banker, held by central banks rather than tied to any single nation's own money. It was, by later assessment, an innovative idea, and some economic historians have since argued the conference was wrong to dismiss it so completely. But Keynes was negotiating from the position of a country left financially exhausted by the war. White was negotiating from the position of a country that held most of the world's gold reserves and had emerged from the war as the dominant economic power on Earth. White's plan became the foundation of the new system. Keynes's banker did not. What actually came out of those 3 weeks was 2 new institutions and 1 central mechanism. The International Development, the institution that became the World Bank, were both established to manage the new system and help finance the reconstruction of a continent the war had leveled. The central mechanism was a fixed exchange rate system built around a single currency. The United States dollar was pegged to gold at $35 an ounce, the one currency in the system directly convertible into the metal. Every other member currency was then pegged to the dollar, allowed to drift no more than 1% from its set rate, and could only be formally adjusted by more than 10% with the International Monetary Fund's approval, and only to correct what the rules called a fundamental disequilibrium. The International Monetary Fund formally came into existence on December 27, 1945, once the first 29 member countries had ratified its Articles of Agreement. It did not begin actual financial operations until March 1, 1947, and on May 8 of that year France became the first country to borrow from it. In practice, this meant the dollar was doing 2 jobs at once. It was the currency the rest of the world held as its reserve, and it was also, at least on paper, as good as gold, free. A foreign government wanted to make that exchange. For a while, that arrangement did exactly what it was designed to do. It gave a shattered continent something stable to rebuild on top of. Between 1948 and 1954, the United States channeled roughly $17 billion in grants to 16 Western European countries under the Marshall Plan, a program built on the argument, in Secretary of State George Marshall's own words, that the breakdown of the business structure of Europe during the war had been complete, and that without substantial help the continent would face economic Bretton Woods gave that reconstruction a stable currency floor to stand on. But a fixed system built around one country's currency has a structural problem built into it, and a Belgian-American economist named Robert Triffin, writing in the 1960s, was the one who named it clearly. The rest of the world needed a growing supply of dollars to use as reserves and to finance international trade. The only way to supply the world with more dollars was for the United States to run payment deficits, sending more dollars out than it took back in. But the more deficits the United States ran to keep the world supplied, the more it eroded confidence that all of those dollars could actually be redeemed for gold at $35 an ounce, if every government holding them tried to cash in at once. The system needed the United States to spend beyond its means in order to function, and every year it did so made the underlying promise a little less credible than the year before. The strain was not only building in economists' models. In February 1965, French President Charles de Gaulle announced that France would exchange its own dollar reserves for gold at the official rate and sent the French Navy across the Atlantic to collect it, a move soon followed. French officials had come to see the arrangement as lopsided, an asymmetric financial system in which foreigners found themselves subsidizing American living standards and American multinationals. In the words of one description of the French position, every additional shipment of gold that crossed the Atlantic that decade was a small, literal demonstration of the exact problem Triffin had already named on paper. By the late 1960s, that tension had stopped being theoretical. Foreign governments were exchanging dollars for gold in amounts large enough that America's own gold reserves were. On the afternoon of Friday, August 13, 1971, President Richard Nixon met in secret at Camp David with a small group of advisors, among them Treasury Secretary John Connally, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, and a Treasury official named Paul Volcker, along with 12 others. 2 days later, on Sunday, August 15, with American financial markets closed for the weekend, Nixon addressed the nation on television. He announced that the United States would suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold, ending, in one sentence, the arrangement sitting at the center of the entire Bretton Woods system. In the same address, he announced a 90-day freeze on wages and prices and a 10% surcharge on imports. The decision was made unilaterally. None of the other 43 nations that had spent 3 weeks negotiating the system in 1944 were consulted beforehand. The system did not die instantly. In December 1971, the major industrial nations met at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington and tried to patch it back together, agreeing to a new dollar standard that repriced gold fluctuate within a wider band around it. It lasted about 14 months. Continued inflation inside the United States made even those wider fixed rates impossible to hold, and by February 1973, Japan and the major European economies had abandoned the pegged system entirely, letting their own currencies float freely against the dollar instead. Within a decade, every industrialized nation had done the same. The arrangement was formally recognized in the Jamaica Accords of 1976, which practice. Floating exchange rates, not a fixed price on gold, were now how the world's currencies related to one another. The two institutions born in that New Hampshire hotel, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, did not go anywhere. The IMF alone now counts 191 member countries. What disappeared was the specific promise that started all of it, that a dollar could always be turned back into a fixed weight of gold. So here is the part worth sitting with. 44 nations through the dollar because the alternative, competitive devaluation and financial chaos had just helped produce a depression and a war. 27 years later, one country ended that fixed price alone on a Sunday night because the alternative, in that administration's own judgment, was worse than breaking the promise. Both decisions were made by people convinced they were choosing stability over chaos. They simply disagreed about which system was actually which. Every currency exchange happening on Earth right now, every time a bank converts one nation's money into another's, even though the one-piece Bretton Woods was actually built around gold at $35 an ounce, has not existed since 1971. What do you think an international monetary system actually needs to hold together? Trust in a commodity, trust in a single government's word, or something else entirely? Leave your answer in the comments. And the next episode follows the dollar's next move after that Sunday night, an arrangement with an oil-producing kingdom that gave the newly unpegged currency somewhere else to stand, one that still shapes energy markets today.